Hello everyone, Just Podcast TV is here. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified on new contents.
Episode 164, Proposing a Bet. All the wealthy merchants from all over the world looked at James. Now they saw him in a different light. James's magnanimity and tolerance instantly attracted everyone's praise, including the winery's workers. Their thoughts were still stuck on the idea of Fernan kneeling on the ground and begging James for forgiveness. But now the two of them were clasping hands warmly. Fernan even gave James a big hug. Obviously, he was deeply impressed by James's character. He felt he would never have been so generous if the roles had been reversed. James turned sideways and invited Fernan to enter the winery with him. "Please, be my distinguished guest." Fernan did not waste any time. He nodded, and the two of them walked side by side into the winery. James and Fernan passed by the wealthy businessmen who were waiting to enter the winery. A Dubaian merchant suddenly stopped James and politely said, "Hello, may I ask you a question?" James smiled and said to him, "Oh, of course, my distinguished guest." He was adjusting to his new role quickly. "How did you do it?" asked the businessman, shaking his head in disbelief. Obviously, he still couldn't believe what had just happened. He couldn't believe that it was true. Well, it's actually very simple. When you look at this world with a beautiful gaze, then the world will also look at you with its most beautiful gaze. After James finished speaking, he laughed and turned around to walk into the main door of the winery with Fernan. The crowd looked at James back with admiration. Bernard was also grateful to him. This new owner was humble and kind. It would be difficult for the winery to not prosper in the future. Even when James, Fernan, and the three beauties had disappeared into the winery, the Dubaian merchant still kept muttering to himself, "Look at the world with a beautiful gaze. Then the world will look back at you. I don't get it. I need to think about it." Meanwhile, Vanessa was saying, "Wow, smell those grapes." James immediately smelled the fragrance of the wine. This was truly a world-class winery. The entire winery was overflowing with the fragrance of wine. It was completely immersed in the intoxicating fragrance. James suspected that the very ground beneath their feet might have a strong fragrance of wine. "It does smell good," said Katie, lifting her hair away from her face in a charming gesture. "I feel like I'm going to get drunk." Krista also had a blissful expression as she sniffed the refreshing fragrance of the wine. James looked at Fernan and said, "If we are talking about wine culture, then we make a lot of great wine in America, especially in the Sonoma Valley in California." James was in a good mood, but although Fernan kept nodding at James, even Vanessa could see that he didn't entirely agree. However, with this kind of relationship, he had no choice but to suck up to James. While Vanessa, Krista, and Katie were privately discussing the ignorant Fernan, a voice instantly entered everyone's ears. "Sir, you are in a good mood." Everyone turned around and saw that the speaker was Bernard, who had caught up to them. James asked casually, "Bernard, do you know anything about American culture?" "Yes, not much, but I studied in Bentham University, so I know a little bit." When James heard this, he revealed a surprised expression. He hadn't expected that answer. He asked with a smile, "Bentham University, does it also exist in France?" "A branch of it does, not only in France, but also in many countries all over the world." When Bernard said this, he seemed especially proud. James was impressed. To think that a Frenchman had attended Bentham University. Not only James, but also the three beautiful women with him looked at Bernard in a different light. They were definitely impressed with his achievements. Just like that, James and Bernard started to chat. The others followed the manager to the villa at the winery. This was also a typical medieval building. It was surrounded by towering ancient trees, and the outer walls were covered with green vines and plants. It looked like an ancient castle. While Bernard led the others in, they saw how luxuriously furnished it was. But James had guests, so he could not accompany the beauties in wandering around the castle. So he said to Bernard, "Please arrange for someone to bring some coffee up to me and Mr. Fernan in the living room. I want to have a good talk with him first." "Yes, sir," Fernan said in a gentlemanly manner. James said to the three beautiful women, "Go anywhere you want. I want to talk to Mr. Fernan about life." that was what they'd been waiting for. They climbed a huge spiral staircase to the top of the villa. Bernard personally brought coffee to James and Vernon. James asked him to assemble all the wealthy businessmen and invite them to attend the banquet. Although Bernard did not understand why, he still did as James asked. After a short chat with Vernon, it was time for the banquet to begin. It was held in the vineyard, and the environment was very elegant. Before the banquet began, James welcomed everyone. When the banquet was well underway, in order to create a more lively atmosphere, James picked up his wine glass and called for quiet. In order to lighten the atmosphere of the banquet, I have a suggestion. I wonder if anyone is interested. What suggestion? Everyone asked curiously. James paused and looked around. Then he asked, I'd like to propose a bet. Want to know what it is? Episode 165. Perfect ending. As soon as James finished speaking, a wealthy businessman asked with interest, What kind of bet are you talking about? What's the prize? The other businessmen wanted to know the same thing. Clearly, they were very interested in James's suggestion. As rich people, they never lacked money. What they lacked was excitement. If James's suggestion had something to do with gambling, it would definitely be exciting, and therefore instantly struck the interest of these wealthy businessmen from all over the world. But James did not answer the question at first. Instead, he took a sip of coffee and said, Since we have all been brought together by wine today, let's bet on wine. Wine gambling. Interesting. Everyone's interest was aroused even further. The merchant who had asked the previous question added, Tell us about the bet, Mr. Tucker. He looked like he could not wait and was eager to give it a try. James saw that everyone was like this and did not waste any time. He said directly, I have a question. The question is about Chateau Remy. It is also about the wine in my winery. The bet is simple. Whoever can answer this question correctly within a minute, I will give him 1,000 bottles of Remy 1982 for free. James paused for a while, obviously to give these guys some time to digest and react. Just as he had expected, his words caused the entire vineyard to explode. 1,000 bottles? I didn't hear that wrong, did I? Everyone sucked in a breath of cold air. The shock in their eyes was indescribable. These guys had come to the annual wine tasting of Chateau Remy, but they had really come for the Remy 1982. Every year they spent a lot of time and money to come here to buy some of the world's best wine at automatically high prices. But the amount they could get was pitifully small. Now they had the chance to get their hands on 1,000 bottles. That would be like manna from heaven. When these wealthy businessmen came to their senses, they all praised James for his bold proposal. However, Bernard was completely dumbfounded. He had no idea what the new owner of the winery was up to. He had already told James some of the difficulties the winery was in. James knew that the stock of Remy 1982 at the winery was depleted. So why had he done this? At this moment, an Italian merchant stood up. Mr. Tucker, since it's a bet, what if we lose? James laughed and said, Good question. If you lose, you will have to sign a contract with our winery and buy the new wine we produce every year for the next 10 years. Are you sure? The Italian exclaimed. It was a no-brainer. If he won, that Remy 1982 would be a huge profit. If he lost, he would be buying and selling Chateau Remy's wine, which was the world's best. James nodded and said with certainty, Of course I'm sure. The vineyard exploded into confusion at his words. The wealthy merchants all expressed their willingness to participate in this gamble. They would be fools not to. James quickly spoke to Bernard, who still had a blank look on his face. Go and prepare the contract. Be quick. The faster, the better. But sir, hurry up and go. Bernard wanted to express his doubts, but James didn't give him a chance. Yes, sir. Seeing James's firm attitude, Bernard didn't dare to say anything else. He quickly nodded and turned around to go and prepare the contract. 10 minutes later, Bernard had prepared many contracts. As soon as the documents arrived, the wealthy businessmen rushed to sign them. In less than 5 minutes, they had all signed. There were more than 100 contracts. Looking at the thick stack of papers in Bernard's hands, James laughed. He could not help murmuring to himself in his heart, "Wow, I made a lot of money this time." He knew he was putting one over on them, but merchants were as cunning as foxes, and they would have done the same to him. James's heart was at ease. The wealthy Dubayan merchant could not wait any longer. "Mr. Tucker, can you tell us the question now?" "Okay," said James. "Bernard, ready your stopwatch." Then he turned to all the merchants and said, "Listen up, everyone. I will only ask this question once. I will not repeat it." The entire vineyard quieted down. James continued, "Everyone, I know that many of you are here for the Remy 1982, but do you know its origin?" Bernard started the stopwatch in his hand. The 1-minute countdown had officially begun. However, Bernard was very worried, and his heart was in his throat. He felt that James's question was too simple. Even Vanessa, Krista, and Katie were worried for James. Everyone looked at everyone else in surprise. For a moment, no one could say anything. They were all rich and sophisticated. They had studied wine diligently, but they were unable to answer this question. A few of the businessmen stood up and tried to answer the question, but Bernard shook his head. They were categorically wrong, across the board. Everyone was at a loss. The prize was so close, but so far away. It was just what James had expected. In the end, these wealthy businessmen from all over the world could only watch helplessly as time passed, second by second, until it ran out. In the end, Bernard pressed the button on his stopwatch with a bright smile on his face. "Everyone, thank you." James raised his glass and drained it in one gulp. It was obvious that he was the winner in this gamble. Bernard smiled. The three beauties laughed. All the wine merchants laughed as well. After all, they were winners too. Episode 166. I'll keep it all for myself. Bernard looked at the thick stack of papers in his hand. He was in an indescribably beautiful mood. This new owner, who had arrived less than a day ago, had made a joking gamble and sold all the new wine in the winery for the next 10 years. He was a business genius. He had just arrived and had solved all the problems of the winery in an instant. It wasn't any supernatural ability. James had only used the internet to know more about this winery that he was about to take over. He had learned that Chateau Remy was now in the limelight, but the stock of Remy 1982 was decreasing. Wine merchants from all over the world loved to promote this vintage, and they often ignored the others the winery produced. Because the cost of wine was so high, just a few bottles could make a merchant a lot of money. For the wine merchants, it was a good thing because they didn't have to make much of an effort to promote it. But for Chateau Remy, it wasn't a good thing. After all, there was a limited amount of Remy 1982, and one day it would all be gone. The winery relied on a few bottles to maintain its reputation. It couldn't sell any of its new wine. Businessmen cared only about profit, not the winery's rich history, much less the feelings of its owners. This was what James had learned on the internet about the problems the winery was facing. And that casual reminder from Bernard had confirmed it. That was why he'd made his bet. He'd directly and decisively solved all the problems in the winery. At this moment, the rich Dubayan merchant laughed and said, "Mr. Tucker, this bet of yours has sold the wine of your winery for the next 10 years. Shouldn't you tell us the correct answer?" James smiled and turned to Bernard. "It's time for you to teach them a history lesson." Bernard smiled brightly and nodded. He was surprised that no one had known the answer, and he was very happy to tell them about Remy 1982. After all, it was the glory of Chateau Remy, the vintage the winery was most proud of, and also the thing that Bernard himself was the most proud of. Bernard cleared his throat. In 1982, 40 years ago, the summer weather was hot and dry. It was a perfect summer. Not only did our winery produce more grapes than usual, but the weather was especially beneficial for the production of wine. Its taste was mellow and sweet. In addition, since 1959, the wine fermented by Western Europe has had a bitter taste. It just so happened that the wine at Chateau Remy stood in sharp contrast to it. With good wine, of course, we had to promote it. In the early 1980s, Chateau Remy was facing a severe economic crisis, so promoting its existing bottles became a difficult problem. But as the owner of Chateau Remy, Robert Parker was a very bold and far-sighted person. With his extraordinary courage, he gained rave reviews for this vintage. He made Chateau Remy a world-renowned wine. This is the origin of the vintage. After Bernard finished speaking, his face was full of pride. The businessmen all murmured appreciatively amongst themselves. They had always known that Remy 1982 was expensive, but they had not known the story behind it. Bernard then happily carried all the contracts inside and began preparations to sell new wine to the merchants. Now he was no longer worried about the winery's future. He would not have to worry about it for the next 10 years. By then, Chateau Remy would not need the 1982 vintage to maintain its reputation. These new wines would forge an even greater reputation for the winery. James smiled as he watched the manager happily prepare the red wine for everyone. He was glad to have Bernard, with his encyclopedic knowledge of the business, on his team. There was nothing the old man did not know about the past of the winery. The banquet came to an end in a cheerful atmosphere. The wealthy merchants left with the new wine they had ordered satisfied. They didn't buy a single bottle of Remy 1982. At the entrance to the winery, Fernan took his leave warmly. "Mr. Tucker, we are friends now. When you come to Paris, you must look me up. When that day comes, I will show you a good time." James laughed. "Of course, if nothing goes wrong, I might go to Paris in a few days. I will definitely pay you a visit." The two men hugged. Fernan waved goodbye and got into his car. "Great job, sir." Seeing that all the guests had finally left and the winery had gained a lot of business that day, Bernard gave James a thumbs up. James laughed and said, "It was my pleasure." Vanessa looked at James's beautiful smile and immediately said with a smile of her own, "James, you're incredible." "Sometimes I think you've changed completely since college," Katie chimed in. "Don't be ridiculous," James said smugly. "Take a closer look at my eyes, my whole face in fact. I've always been this devastatingly handsome." As soon as he finished his sentence, the three women snorted at him at the same time. Krista, who was usually too serious to crack jokes, could not help but say, "Sir, I've seen narcissists, but I have never seen someone as narcissistic as you." The three women instantly burst into laughter. "By the way, Bernard, I haven't had the chance to ask. How much Remy 1982 does the winery have left?" asked James. "You have no pressing business at the moment, sir. Why don't I take you to the wine cellar?" Bernard said with a smile. James was instantly interested when he heard Bernard's words. Good idea. Vanessa, who had studied red wine, was even more excited. She gave a little jump for joy. She was still a kid. Their surroundings were really beautiful, but James had been busy with the business of the winery since he'd arrived. He hadn't had a chance to appreciate them. The style of this medieval manor was completely different from anything he'd seen back home. He was impressed by the sense of ancient history it gave him. It was also very luxurious. The four of them strolled leisurely after Bernard and soon arrived in front of an ancient castle. Bernard said that the wine cellar was under this unique castle. This was a cellar specially built to store red wine. It was almost 300 years old. James took a closer look. Although the outer wall of the castle was tightly wrapped by green vines and plants, he could still see the vicissitudes of time written on it. Soon, Bernard opened the gate of the castle. He led everyone down a flight of stairs and entered the cellar below the castle. It was full of huge barrels of wine. The fragrance of the wine was thick. It was truly almost intoxicating. James was completely stunned by the scene, to say nothing of Vanessa with her knowledge of wine. Bernard informed James and the rest that these barrels were not ordinary barrels. Instead, they were all equipped with a special device that allowed the wine stored in these cellars to be kept at the ideal temperature. These barrels were called ice barrels. James looked at the old man and asked again about the 1982 vintage. Bernard pointed at a group of barrels and said to James with some heartache, "There are only about 100 barrels left." This committed employee felt that his heart was bleeding with every drop that was sold. James nodded and then said, "From now on, not one drop of Remy 1982 will be sold to the public." His words made Bernard's heart leap. But then James said, "I want to keep all of it for myself to drink." Bernard looked at James, speechless.